Congressional newcomer Rep. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, D-N.Y, recently made the wild claim that unless global warming is addressed, the world has only 12 years left. And I think the part of it that is generational is that millennials and people in Gen Z, and all these folks that come after us are looking up and we're like, the world is gonna end in 12 years if we don't address climate change, she said. That's not likely if history is a reliable guide, according to Marc Morano of the Climate Depot website, who points to similar warnings dating back 150 years. He quotes an MIT professor who said, as early as 1864, George Perkins Marsh, sometimes said to be the father of American ecology, warned that the Earth was fast becoming an unfit home for its noblest inhabitant, and that unless men changed their ways it would be reduced to such a condition of impoverished productiveness, of shattered surface, of climatic excess, as to threaten the depravation, barbarism, and perhaps even extinction of the species. Morano cited British scientist Philip Stott saying the Earth has been given a 10-year survival warning regularly for the last 50 or so years. We have been serially doomed. Ocasio-Cortez statement at AOC on millennials and social media. We're like, the world is going to end in 12 years if we don't address climate change. pic.twitter.com/jhbviffen4, Tom Elliott. At Tom's Elliott, January 22, 2019. But Morano pointed out she's only the latest activist to join in the endless climate tipping point movement, joining former Vice President Al Gore, former President Barack Obama, UN leaders and Prince Charles. Morano's book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Climate Change, notes the many warnings of a tipping point, including British Prime Minister Gordon Brown warning in 2009 there were only 50 days to change the world. The same year, Prince Charles declared the world had just 96 months to make changes. It is becoming obvious that the only authentic climate tipping point we can rely is this one. Flashback 2007, New Zealand scientist on global warming. It's all going to be a joke in 5 years, Morano wrote. The Boston Globe noted on April 16, 2014, the world now has a rough deadline for action on climate change. Nations need to take aggressive action in the next 15 years to cut carbon emissions, in order to forestall the worst effects of global warming, says the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Such warnings also were issued in 1982, 1989 and 2000. In 2007, UN IPCC Chief Pachauri declared 2012 as the climate deadline to act or it would be too late, Morano reported. Not to be outdone by the UN, former Irish President Mary Robinson weighed in this week, issuing a more generous 20-year tipping point. Former president says we have 20 years to save the world from climate change effects. Robinson calls for climate agreement by 2015. Robinson noted that global leaders have, at most, 2 decades to save the world. NASA warned Barack Obama in 2009 that he had 4 years to save the world, but in 2012, the UN gave Obama and planet Earth another 4-year reprieve, Morano said. Former Vice President Al Gore said in 2006 the world had just 12 years. Former Colorado Sen. Tim Wirth, a Democrat, said 2012 was Obama's last window of opportunity to get it right. Others have pushed the tipping out further into the future. Michael Mann weighed in with his 2036 Mayan calendar-type deadline. Other global warming activists chose 2047 as the key date. Finding no date agreement, 20 governments chose 2030 as the scary deadline, the report noted. Reuters said more than 100 million people will die and global economic growth will be cut by 3.2% of GDP by 2030 if the world fails to tackle climate change, a report commissioned by 20 governments said. Morano noted, the problem with tipping points is that they can never be proven wrong, only right in retrospect. And that, of course, makes citing them a wonderful rhetorical device for doomsayers. Ocasio-Cortez, who previously announced her desire for Democrats to take back all 3 chambers of Congress, the presidency, the Senate and the House, was interviewed at a Martin Luther King Jr. event in New York. she said, in part, and I think the part of it that is generational is that millennials and people in Gen Z, and all these folks that come after us are looking up and we're like, the world is gonna end in 12 years if we don't address climate change, she continued. Your biggest issue is how are we going to pay for it? And like this is the war, this is our World War II. And I think for younger people looking at this are more like, how are we saying let's take it easy when 3,000 Americans died last year? How are we saying let's take it easy when the end person died from our cruel and unjust criminal justice system? How are we saying take it easy? The America that we're living in today is so dystopian, with people sleeping in their cars so they can work a second job without healthcare, and we're told to settle down. It's a fundamental separation between that fierce urgency of now, the why we can't wait that King spoke of. That at some point this chronic realities do reach breaking point, and I think for our generation it reached that. I wished I didn't have to be doing every post, but sometimes I just feel like people aren't being held accountable. Until we all start pitching in and holding people accountable, I'm just gonna let them have it. In 2007, Whistleblower magazine reported, after Gore won an Oscar for his apocalyptic film, An Inconvenient Truth, scientists believed the threat was overblown or non-existent. The report explained, to begin with, those who believe the dire warnings of today's establishment press should know, as U.S. Sen. James Inhofe has pointed out, that, for more than 100 years, journalists have quoted scientists predicting the destruction of civilization by, in alternation, either runaway heat, or a new ice age. Believe it or not, over the last century America's major media have predicted an impending global climate crisis 4 different times, each prediction warning that entire countries would be wiped out or that lower crop yields would mean billions will die. In 1895, the panic was over an imminent ice age. Later, in the late 1920s, when the Earth's surface warmed less than half a degree, the media jumped on a new threat, global warming, which continued into the late 1950s. Then in 1975, the New York Times headline blared, a major cooling widely considered to be inevitable. Then in 1981 it was back to global warming, with the Times quoting 7 government atmospheric scientists who predicted global warming of an almost unprecedented magnitude, the report said.